Good afternoon, Vietnam War students. Mr. Powell here again. Just going to talk about some of these guys right here. There we go. Stuck in my dartboard. If you're following along with the essential questions and stuff that I gave you before with your notes, we're looking at page 6, and page 6 is these individuals pictured here. That's going to be kind of small for you, so I wrote the pertinent information on excuse me, the whiteboard below, so that you guys can just copy that into your notes. The first guy pictured there, the one and only guy in color, you can just stay down here.
Okay.
Assistant producer. All right. So the first guy listed there is Robert McNamara. It's got the name printed for you, but his title and his occupation, I guess, in the government was Secretary of Defense. So essentially, he makes sure that the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force are all running. He's kind of in charge of that for the president and handles that stuff for the president. The second guy listed there is McGeorge Bundy, kind of a strange name. A real smart guy. You can just write NSA. He's the National Security Advisor to the president. This is next person pictured there is labeled Dean Rusk. Dean Rusk was the Secretary of State. So the Secretary of the State is the position in government whereby you handle all the diplomatic affairs with other countries, that you network with other countries. The ambassadors that we have in embassies throughout the world would all be people who essentially answered to Dean Rusk as the Secretary of State. Hillary Clinton used to be the Secretary of State for Barack Obama. Now it's a guy named Mike Pompeo. So that's kind of an important position. Next guy listed, he's wearing a military type uniform, is General Maxwell Teller. JCOS stands for Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So this is the top military advisors from each service that advise the president on affairs concerning the military, whether it's just internal stuff or if it's like really serious national defense stuff. And the president needs advice from the top brains in the military. So these guys are all holdovers from John F. Kennedy. So if you're kind of following along, and the other week at some point we had to mention that John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, right? But his staff essentially stays on, and his staff answers to Lyndon Johnson. So Lyndon Johnson took over and kept those guys, but he felt like it wasn't really his presidency until he won the presidency. And you looked at that as the 1964 election last time, and hopefully you didn't. I don't think you had to do it, but hopefully you watched the Daisy Girl commercial. Daisy Girl is one of the most famous TV political ads ever in the history of TV. And if you didn't see it, well, then you don't know why. But if you did, you get it. Anyway, I'm just going to kind of speed through some things here in the notes because in some cases we would have been reading stuff in class or something like that for our notes, but I'm just going to dispense with that here. So the next thing below the four guys labeled the best and brightest from the cabinet is a strategic Hamlets program. So we mentioned before that guerrilla warfare, the guerrillas are supposed to move through the populace as a fish moves through water. So the strategic Hamlets program is essentially trying to take away the water. They're getting the people in the villages that the Viet Cong and the guerrillas rely on, and they are removing the people from the villages, and they're putting them in a different village, a new village, and saying, you're going to live here now. You've been forcibly moved, and that way we are set up to where we can prevent the communist guerrillas from getting in, and we're protecting it. There's barbed wire, moats, stakes, all kinds of stuff like that around the village to keep the communists out. Did it work? It sounds like a good idea, when you keep in mind what we talked about the other week with what guerrillas really need. But in essence, it didn't work because it was such a burden on the Vietnamese people who were just trying to grow their crops and make a living. These people are very deeply connected to their local land and their villages in a way that we maybe can't appreciate. Like, so maybe you live in Delco and you think, well, I'll just move to California, or I'll move to Center City, Philadelphia. These guys don't quite think that way. They're sort of connected to their land through like ancestor worship and stuff like that, whereby, you know, their dead ancestors are spiritually sort of around, and it's really kind of a different vibe than we could appreciate here in southeastern Pennsylvania. So that's what it was supposed to do, but what it did, it really kind of ticked off the people that were subject to this, and the guerrillas were still able to penetrate strategic hamlets sometimes anyway. So below strategic hamlets, you'll see another bolded word. It says Bin Jia. Bin Jia. Kind of tough to pronounce maybe. We're not used to saying words like that. But it's a village name, Bin Jia. It was a village. It was mostly, there's a blank there. It was mostly Catholic. I mentioned before that because of the French influence, there were a lot of Catholics in Vietnam. And this particular village was inhabited by Catholics who had fled the north. Catholics and communists don't mix. They're like oil and water. They don't get along. So the Catholics left North Vietnam, and this was a village that they had set up in the south. So the Viet Cong targeted this village. They wanted to take these guys out. So they did raid the village, and there was a very pitched battle resulting from this raid into the village and how they took it over. It was essentially a trap they set up for the South Vietnamese government forces. The South Vietnamese government forces attacked with their troops. In some cases, some of their fairly elite troops. American advisors were present. Americans, in terms of combat troops, aren't really in Vietnam yet, but advisors are, and advisors are helping to train and working with the South Vietnamese friends of ours. And they really got chewed up. They thought it was going to be the usual Viet Cong raid. There'd be a few guys, they'd take a few shots, they'd run away once the real soldiers came from the government. Not this time. There were close to 1,000 Viet Cong there present at this village, and they stood and fought. They had some pretty hardcore weapons. They had recoilless rifles. They had RPGs. A lot of helicopters were shot down and hit that were supporting the government forces. Some Americans were killed because they were the pilots. APCs were brought in, or armored personnel carriers, which are these big, sort of boxy looking things. They're a little bit like tanks without a turret. They were brought in. Some of them were taken out by the recoilless rifles and the RPGs of the communist forces. And it was really an all-day battle, which pretty much ended around nighttime. Around nighttime, the VC slipped away and got away. But there's some disturbing questions for that. How come the VC changed their tactics? How come they're tougher now? How come they've got more heavy weapons? How come there are about 1,000 of these guys ready for a pitched battle within 60 miles of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam? So how did all this stuff happen? So it leads to some very disturbing questions for the South Vietnamese government and their American allies. If you flip over and look at page 7, I've got a couple of attacks listed. There's the Bin Hoa attack, Brinks Hotel, Bin Jia, which I covered on the last page, Pleiku, all maybe a little bit tough to pronounce. Bin Hoa is it's an air base. It's an air base in South Vietnam. The Americans are operating out of the air base because, like I said, there's no troops, but we do have air assets in the area. This gets hit by the Viet Cong, and they destroy some planes. Some Americans are killed. The Brinks Hotel is a tourist type explosion. Fortunately, kind of the stuff that we've maybe grown up with. And it's just straight terrorism. Somebody just planted a bomb in a hotel that was populated by Americans, blew it up, killed a bunch of Americans. Bin Jia, like I said, is covered on the last page. Pleiku, February of 1965. This is also an attack by the Viet Cong on an American air facility. This isn't in the vicinity of Saigon, though. This is up in the Central Highlands, which would be sort of like up in here, you know. This is more, here's Saigon, I guess, roughly. It's like the city area, but the Central Highlands is very mountainous. It's sort of like, you know, their Poconos or something like that. a little more wild and woolly than the Poconos, I'd say, definitely. But so all this stuff is starting to escalate in Vietnam. It's starting to spin out of control. At least that was the feeling among some of the American hierarchy, like the president and his staff felt that it's getting out of control. I don't know if we can really help the South Vietnamese from afar anymore. And you're going to start to see Johnson escalate his air campaign. A couple other names. I neglected to stick these down before, but I didn't write them. But these individuals here are the leadership cadre for the North Vietnamese. So this guy you probably know. If you know anything about the war, you know Ho Chi Minh. He's kind of like a spiritual leader almost for these communists in the North and South. But he had sort of like a mystical kind of feeling about him as far as they were concerned. Guy in the middle is Vo Nguyen Giap. That's how you pronounce his name, roughly. I'm pretty good, but I'm not great. He's a general, is a North Vietnamese communist general, and he's sort of the architect of the Dien Bien Phu attack. This guy, Lê Duan, is a very high up guy in the communist hierarchy in the North, and after Ho dies, he pretty much runs most of the war. Also, I wanted to talk about another guy named William Westmoreland, and I'll write his name up here. It's a pretty important name. All right, William Westmoreland. He's the general for the United States for the first several years that we're actually in the country and in combat. So I'll talk about him maybe a little bit more in a minute. But if you see below those three guys I listed, it says, how do we win World War II? Well, you guys were students of mine for that, the World War II part of the course. And really, if you were going to boil it down, we took land, we held land, we destroyed the enemy's capacity to make war, both with bombing and with the conquest of those lands. So maybe, for example, in the Pacific, we did the island hopping up towards Japan, and then maybe that's not the best example because it ended with the nuclear weapon. But also with the case of Germany, they had the naval warfare against the submarines out in the Atlantic, and then the Russians were pushing in, and we invaded Africa and took over North Africa and denied them that, and then moved in from France, and simultaneously there's the bombing campaign that destroys Germany's factories and weapons and everything else that they used to produce to make war. So that's what we could do really to destroy Japan and Nazi Germany in World War II. But this is different. We went over the guerrilla warfare tactics last class. This is going to be different. So as we go in and you see the United States going in and bombing North Vietnam, does North Vietnam make its weapons? No, they don't really make their own weapons that much. They're getting stuff from Russia, from China. So unless you're going to go destroy the factories in China and Russia via bombing or whatever other method, the North Vietnamese are still going to get their weapons, in some cases advanced weapons, that are going to kill Americans and maybe down American planes and stuff like that. So the way we won World War II is really not applicable here, or at least we didn't really fully use that approach. We took sort of the half measures. We made it look like we were trying to win World War II, but we didn't go in. We didn't invade Hanoi. We didn't invade North Vietnam. We didn't go after their communist allies, the Chinese and Russians. That when we did that in World War II, we won. But this was a war that was going to be run with certain rules and boundaries and things you couldn't do. And in World War II, obviously, that was nothing was off the table. You could do anything you had to do to win, pretty much. So William Westmoreland comes in when American troops get put ashore in March of 1965. They start putting Marines in there to protect the air bases that are in the area and getting attacked now. And as this troop level grows year by year by year, Westmoreland adopts what you call a strategy of attrition. All right, attrition is you're going to hit me and I'm going to hit you, and you're going to get tired of it and lose because I'm hitting you harder. That's sort of attrition in a nutshell. It's just about killing the enemy. It's just about numbers. It's a numbers game. We're going to kill so many of you that you just can't fight anymore. And you'll see as American troops go out to the countryside, they don't speak the language. They're foreigners. They're culturally alien to the Vietnamese. They don't know who's the good guys and who's the bad guys. You might kill the wrong people. You get lucky and you kill a Viet Cong soldier. That guy's dead. Maybe somebody who liked him and was his relative or whatever comes and takes his place. If you kill somebody who's innocent and wasn't a Viet Cong soldier, you made a mistake, and now maybe that whole family or that whole village is now against you and your effort. So the attrition strategy of William Westmoreland was a blunt instrument. You need a scalpel for this, and he's coming in with like a meat cleaver or an axe or something like that and creating a huge mess. That's kind of the U.S. approach that we're going to adopt. Below that, you'll see rolling thunder. Rolling thunder is a term used by the LBJ administration to describe their air war against the Vietnamese. I'm going to go through this real quick via lecture, but if you want, I'll stick a link onto the classroom, and you guys can watch a pretty good documentary on this. And of course, since you are Vietnam War students and World War II students, what do you want to see? You want to see things blow up. So you'll see a lot of things blow up, but I'll just kind of roll through Rolling Thunder, if you'll excuse the pun. So when, why, and how did it begin? Rolling Thunder's about March of 1965. This is an escalation. As you know, there's the Gulf of Tonkin incident, then there's some of the attacks on U.S. installations and the Brinks Hotel bombing, and so on. And LBJ figures if you're going to escalate, then we're going to escalate too. And you see American planes starting to go over into North Vietnam and bombing certain targets there. So I said certain targets. They didn't bomb everything and anything. There were complaints voiced by the pilots, and this was not necessarily a military campaign in the pure sense of the word. This was a little bit more of a political campaign. This is sort of like a tete-a-tete between LBJ and Ho Chi Minh's Communist Party up in the north. So typically the pilots would fly the same routes in and then out of the target areas frequently. The target list was politicized. LBJ and his administration would go over targets personally and approve certain ones, and other ones were off the list that you couldn't hit. And the military guys wanted to hit certain targets, but they weren't allowed to because of the political situation. For instance, there's the Red River dikes up here in North Vietnam. There are these massive dams and walls and things that hold back river water so that there can be little nice, neat little rice paddies and things in North Vietnam instead of a giant like swollen lake and swampy thing that just gets crushed by floods and stuff all the time. That could have been blown out by our pilots pretty easily and made a serious disruption to that society and destroyed their food source. MiG bases that were under construction were off limits. So MiGs are the Soviet made jet aircraft that the North Vietnamese had, and yes, they did have aircraft, and there was an air war over Vietnam, and there were dogfights between North Vietnamese fighters and American fighters in Vietnam. Not real dogfights, Caroline. The dogs were fine.
Okay.
It's just the term for the aircraft fighting each other. Okay, so there's definitely some other targets that they could hit, bridges, things like that, and those were off limits. So it seemed kind of ridiculous to the pilots. It made their job harder. It made it much more dangerous, and that dangerous job would lead to guys getting killed, guys getting captured. One pilot, Everett Alvarez, was in jail in North Vietnam for about 7.5 years. So stuff's really no joke. I mean, you can lose a major chunk of your life, if not your whole life, because of these decisions that are being made by the politicians in Washington, D.C. So North Vietnamese aren't necessarily the most technologically advanced people in the world at this time, but guess what? They did have probably the best air defense system that money could buy in the 1960s and 70s, because they got the most advanced stuff from the Soviets and Chinese in there. The Soviets would be excuse me, very interested in knowing how their guided missiles work against American aircraft. What if they have to fight the United States? Where do you want to test it out? In the skies over North Vietnam. So they would import those, the North Vietnamese would import those weapons from Russia, and the Russians could kind of get to see how well their stuff worked against U.S. aircraft. The former senator that's featured in the film, John McCain, Senator John McCain from Arizona, he's in the film. If you decide to watch it, you don't have to. But John McCain's in there, and they interview him, but he was shot down. He was a prisoner in what's called the Hanoi Hilton, which was it's not a Hilton hotel. It's a prison.